There's a bracelet sitting in a velvet-lined case inside Buckingham Palace right now that has quietly outlived 4 owners, survived a war, crossed the world on the wrist of the most photographed woman of the 20th century, and ended up, almost by accident, on the arm of the woman she once called the Rottweiler. This is not a rumor. This is not a leaked palace whisper picked up by an anonymous source. This is a documented, photographed jewel history fact, T. And once you understand it, you will never look at a royal banquet photograph the same way again. Let's start in the 1920s, because that is where every good royal jewelry story actually starts. A young woman named Elizabeth Bowes-Lyon has just married the Duke of York, the shy, stammering second son of King George V. Nobody in that family expects this quiet young duke to ever become king. His older brother, David, is the golden boy, the heir, the one destined for the throne. So the Duke of York and his new wife settle into a life that looks, by royal standards, almost ordinary. He gives her gifts the way any devoted young husband might. Birthdays, Christmases, small tokens of affection. Except his idea of a small token is a trip to Cartier. Between 1923 and 1925, the Duke of York bought his wife 5 separate bracelets from Cartier, each one an Art Deco masterpiece, each one meant to be worn alone, or, as Elizabeth loved to do, stacked, together on one wrist so that the whole arm seemed to catch fire in candlelight. 2 of the 5 were set entirely in diamonds. The other 3 each carried a different colored gemstone worked into that clean, geometric, unmistakably 1920s design. One with emeralds, one with sapphires, and the one we care about most today, set with rubies. Picture the young Duchess of York in the mid-1920s, and the formal portraits that survive from that era. Her arms stacked with all 5 bracelets at once, paired with tiaras that had names like the Lotus Flower Tiara and the Strathmore Rose Tiara. This was a woman who understood jewelry not as vanity, but as language. She wore stories on her wrists. Nobody in that photograph could have imagined what was coming. In 1936, King Edward VIII abdicated the throne to marry Wallis Simpson, and suddenly the shy Duke of York was King George VI. Following and his wife, jauntily stacking Cartier bracelets at dinner parties, was Queen Elizabeth. The bracelets that had once been sweet, private gifts between a happily obscure couple were now part of the working wardrobe of the British monarchy. They appear again and again through the decades. They show up bandeau mounted across her forehead at a ballet performance in the early 1930s. They show up at a Red Cross gala later that same year. Fashions changed as the decades rolled on. Hemlines rose and fell, wars were fought and won, and this woman who started as a duchess and ended as the Queen Mother kept wearing her Cartier bracelets, on and off, for the better part of 50 years. Then, in the 1970s, something happens that royal historians love to point to as the real beginning of this story's second act. The Queen Mother, growing older, begins passing pieces of her collection down to her daughter, who by this point has been Queen Elizabeth II for 2 decades. The Cartier bracelets go to her, and Queen Elizabeth II does something her mother never quite did in the same way. She starts lending them out. This is the detail that almost nobody talking about royal jewelry mentions, and it is the detail that makes this whole story worth telling. In 1983, during a grueling 6-week royal tour of Australia and New Zealand, the young Princess of Wales, 21 years old, thrown into a spotlight so intense it is hard to overstate even now, needed jewelry appropriate for a state visit at the Rest Point Hotel in Tasmania. And the Queen, her mother-in-law, loaned her one of those very bracelets. The Queen Mother's diamond bracelet from that same Cartier set on the wrist of Princess Diana, photographed for the world during one of the most scrutinized tours in royal history. Think about what that moment actually was. Diana was barely out of her teens. She had been Princess of Wales for less than 2 years. She was still learning, in real time in front of flashing cameras on the other side of the planet, how to be royal. And for that trip, the family handed her a piece of history that had been sitting on a duchess's wrist 60 years earlier, back when nobody in that family expected to wear a crown at all. It was, in its own quiet way, an act of trust. You do not lend out Art Deco Cartier heirlooms to just anyone. You lend them to family you believe in. Diana wore it. The cameras caught it. And then, as royal tours end and life moves on, the bracelet went back into the vault, back into the collection. And Diana's own jewelry story moved in other directions entirely. She built her own identity through jewels over the following years, the pieces people now associate with her directly, her engagement sapphire, her pearl chokers, the tiaras she wore before her divorce. The Cartier ruby and diamond set from the 1920s was never really hers. It was borrowed. It was a moment. Now fast forward. Diana dies in 1997. The world grieves in a way that still, decades later, feels almost impossible to fully explain to anyone who wasn't alive to watch it happen. Her sons grow up. Her former husband remarries in 2005, a woman named Camilla Parker Bowles, a woman who had been, for years before that, one of the most vilified figures in modern royal history, blamed by huge portions of the public for the collapse of the fairy tale marriage that had captivated the world. For years after that wedding, Camilla wore very little of the grand historic jewelry associated with the senior royal women who came before her. She wasn't queen. She was the Duchess of Cornwall, and there was, by all accounts, a careful, deliberate sensitivity around what she would and would not be. Scene-wearing, particularly anything with a direct visual line back to Diana. The public's wounds were still raw. The tabloids were still watching for exactly this kind of narrative, the second wife stepping into the first wife's shoes, quite literally, jewel by jewel. But time changes what is possible. In 2022, Queen Elizabeth II dies after 70 years on the throne. Charles becomes king, Camilla becomes queen, and suddenly the entire logic of royal jewelry succession shifts under everyone's feet. Because that is how this system has always worked. The collection belongs, in practice, to whoever is wearing the crown. Queen Elizabeth II inherited her mother's bracelets. Now, upon her own death, those same pieces move again, this time into the hands of her son's wife. This is where the story picks back up in a way that genuinely happened on real documented occasions, not in some manufactured headline. Queen Camilla began, gradually, to wear the Queen Mother's Cartier bracelets herself. First the emerald one, debuted in February of 2024 at a Shakespeare anniversary reception, paired with a green velvet dress. Then, in December of that same year, the ruby and diamond bracelet made its first public appearance on Camilla's wrist, at a state banquet at Buckingham Palace honoring the visiting Emir of Qatar. She paired it with a red velvet gown and a stack of heirloom diamonds, and by February of 2025, at a private dinner at Highgrove House, she had worn 3 of the 5 bracelets from that original 1920s set, plus one of the 2 all-diamond pieces. The exact bracelet that once sat on a 21-year-old Diana's wrist in Tasmania in 1983 is, right now, part of the working jewelry collection of the woman Diana's family, and much of the British public spent 2 decades resenting. There was no shouting match at a state banquet. There was no dramatic moment where a king stood up, silenced a room, and pointed at his wife's wrist in fury. That is invented drama, the kind that spreads fast online precisely because it plays on a real, raw cultural memory. The idea that Camilla, in some symbolic sense, took Diana's place. But the actual history is subtler and, if you ask me, more interesting than any fake scandal could be, because it reveals something true about how royal jewelry actually functions inside that family. These pieces are not personal possessions in the way a normal inheritance works. They are institutional. They belong to the role, not fully to the individual. A bracelet bought as a private gift between a young duke and his new wife in 1923 became, within a decade, a piece of state jewelry, hauled out for banquets and photographed for magazines, and eventually loaned across the world to a princess who happened for a few weeks in 1983 to need something suitably grand for a tour of Tasmania. When Diana's marriage ended and her life ended, the bracelet did not go with her into some separate legacy. It simply returned to the collection, waiting for the next woman who would carry the title that made her eligible to wear it. That is genuinely how most of what people call Diana's jewelry actually worked, and it's worth clearing up, because a huge amount of confusion floats around online about which pieces were truly Diana's own property versus which were merely worn by her during her time as Princess of Wales. Some jewelry Diana owned outright, purchased for her personally or gifted to her as her own property, and those pieces did pass down according to her wishes, largely to her sons, and from them onward, some pieces have gone to Kate, the Princess of Wales, and some have gone to Meghan during her time in the family. But a huge portion of what Diana wore during her most iconic public moments was never hers to keep. It was the institution's jewelry, loaned to whoever was, at that moment, the most senior young royal woman needing something suitably splendid for a state occasion. The tiara Diana wore at her wedding, famously, was not even purchased for her. It was borrowed from her own family, the Spencers, and there is a long tradition of aristocratic and royal women wearing pieces that technically belong to an estate, a title, or a collection, rather than to them as private individuals. So when you see headlines breathlessly announcing that Camilla is wearing Diana's jewelry, what is usually actually happening is one of 2 very different things. Either Camilla is wearing something Diana genuinely owned, and that has since, through some chain of inheritance or gifting within the family, ended up available to her, which is rarer and more sensitive. Or, far more commonly, Camilla is wearing something from the shared royal collection that Diana also happened to wear during her time in the family, the same way the Queen Mother wore it before Diana, and the way Queen Elizabeth II wore it after the Queen Mother. The ruby and diamond Cartier bracelet is squarely in that second category. It was never Diana's, it was the family's, on loan to her for a season, the way it has been on loan to nearly every senior royal woman for the better part of a century. None of that makes it any less fascinating to think about. There is something almost eerie about a single object traveling the far across time and through that much personal history. This bracelet has been photographed on a duchess who never expected to be queen, then on a queen mother in mourning black at her husband's funeral, then on a young anxious princess trying to hold herself together on the other side of the world, and now on a woman who spent 30 years as the most controversial figure in modern British royal history before finally, quietly becoming queen herself. If you laid all those photographs side by side, decade by decade, you would be looking at nearly 100 years of British royal womanhood condensed into one small circle of gold, diamonds, and rubies. And Camilla, it's worth saying, did not rush into wearing any of this. For the better part of 2 decades after her marriage to Charles, she was famously restrained about which pieces she chose to wear in public, and royal jewelry historians who track these things closely have noted, again and again, how deliberately she seemed to avoid anything that might read as stepping into Diana's specific visual territory. It was really only after becoming queen, after the death of Elizabeth II placed the entire historic collection formally into her keeping as the wife of the reigning monarch, that Camilla began working through pieces like the Cartier bracelets, the Belgian sapphire tiara, and various other heirlooms that had spent decades associated primarily with her predecessors. Even then, she has tended to debut these pieces slowly, one at a time, spaced out across many months, almost as if testing the waters each time, watching how the public and the press respond before reaching for the next one. That pattern matters because it undercuts the entire premise of a dramatic, sudden, scandalous moment at a state banquet. The real story is the opposite of dramatic. It is slow, it is careful. It unfolds over years, not over one tense dinner. Camilla wore the emerald bracelet in February of 2024. She waited 10 months before debuting the ruby one in December. She waited another 2 months before pairing multiple bracelets together at Highgrove. This is not the behavior of someone recklessly, carelessly putting on a dead woman's jewelry without a thought. This is the behavior of someone acutely aware of the symbolism attached to every single piece she puts on her body in public. Someone managing decades of complicated public feeling, one careful appearance at a time. It's also worth understanding why these bracelets in particular carry so much weight beyond the Diana connection. The Art Deco period, the 1920s specifically, is considered by jewelry historians to be one of the true golden ages of design, a moment when houses like Cartier were moving away from the heavy, ornate Victorian and Edwardian styles and towards something cleaner, more geometric, more architecturally daring. The 5 bracelets the Duke of York bought his wife are considered exceptional examples of that style, each one balanced and symmetrical in a way that feels almost modern even now, a century later. Jewelry experts who have examined the full set describe the craftsmanship as remarkable, even by the extraordinarily high standards Cartier was setting during that era. These were not simply expensive baubles. They were and remain genuine artistic achievements, the kind of pieces that end up displayed in museum exhibitions, which several pieces from the Queen Mother's broader collection have in fact done in recent years. And rubies themselves carry their own layer of symbolic weight within royal jewelry culture specifically. They are traditionally associated with passion, protection, and vitality, and within the specific context of the British royal collection, rubies have repeatedly been chosen for gifts marking major life events, coronations, weddings, significant tours. The Queen Mother herself owned multiple ruby pieces beyond just this bracelet, including a ruby and diamond brooch shaped like a hibiscus flower, a gift from the Australian people during a 1958 visit, and a matching pair of ruby floral clip brooches commissioned from Cartier in the 1940s. Queen Elizabeth II later commissioned an entire ruby tiara in the 1970s, using rubies she had received as wedding gifts, and Camilla herself has now worn that tiara at multiple state banquets, paired, fittingly, with her own separate set of ruby and diamond earrings. So there is, in a sense, an entire ruby lineage running through this family, distinct from but related to the specific bracelet at the center of this story, and Camilla appears to be steadily working her way through nearly all of it. Royal jewelry watchers who track these appearances obsessively, and there is a genuinely dedicated global community of them, tend to view this as evidence that Camilla, whatever complicated feelings the public may still hold about her, has developed real fluency and even affection for the history embedded in these pieces. She is not simply putting on whatever her stylists hand her. The pattern of her choices, which colors she pairs with which gowns, which anniversaries or state visits she saves particular pieces for, suggests someone who has actually studied the provenance of what she's wearing and is choosing deliberately. None of this erases the discomfort some people still feel watching her wear pieces with any connection at all to Diana, however indirect. That discomfort is real and understandable, and it is precisely the emotional nerve that fabricated stories like dramatic banquet confrontations are designed to hit, a made-up story about King Charles furiously halting a state dinner because his wife dared to wear a ruby bracelet plays directly into a public wound that has never fully closed. The sense that Camilla's rise happened at Diana's expense, that every ring, brooch, and bracelet she wears is somehow a small victory lap. It is emotionally potent content precisely because the underlying feeling it exploits, resentment over how that marriage ended and what came after, is genuine and widely shared, even 30 years on. But real history, when you actually dig into it the way we have here, tends to be messier and less satisfying than a clean villain narrative, and also, I'd argue, considerably more interesting. There was no confrontation. There was no scandal. There was a young duke buying his new wife 5 bracelets in the 1920s because he loved her and had good taste. There was a war, a coronation nobody expected, decades of quiet, loyal service, a loan to a young and frightened princess trying to survive a brutal tour on the other side of the world, a death that shook the entire planet, another death. Decades later, that reshuffled an entire collection. And a woman who had spent 30 years as public enemy number 1, slowly, carefully, deliberately stepping into pieces of history that were never really about her, or about Diana either, but about the institution both women found themselves serving in their own very different ways. That is the real story hiding underneath the fake headline. Not a halted banquet, not a furious king, just a single Art Deco bracelet bought in the 1920s, worn by 4 different women across a century of British royal history, each of them carrying, whether they wanted to or not, just a little bit of everyone who wore it before them. And somewhere in a vault in Buckingham Palace tonight, there are still 2 more of those original 5 bracelets waiting their turn, the ones Camilla has not yet worn in public. Royal jewelry watchers are already speculating about when and where and with what gown we might finally see them. If the pattern of the last 2 years holds, and it will not be sudden, and it will not be dramatic. It will be quiet, deliberate, and photographed, one careful step at a time, the same way it has always been. It's worth stepping back for a moment and asking why this particular kind of story spread so easily in the first place, because the mechanics of it tell you almost as much as the history does. A headline like King Charles halts banquet after noticing Camilla wearing Diana's bracelet works on the internet for a very specific reason. It compresses 3 things people already feel strongly about into a single sentence: grief for Diana, lingering suspicion of Camilla, and a fantasy of Charles finally, publicly, taking his first wife's side. None of those feelings are irrational. They are the emotional residue of one of the most publicly dissected marriages and divorces in modern history. But feelings being real does not make the specific claim built on top of them real. And that gap between genuine, emotional resonance and actual verified fact is exactly where this kind of content thrives. Nobody fact-checks a headline that confirms what they already suspected about a family they've been watching, in some cases, for their entire lives. It also helps to understand just how mechanical the production of these stories has become. If you search for the exact phrasing of the claim we started with today, you don't find one investigative article. You find a cluster of near-identical video titles, posted days or weeks apart, from different channels, each one swapping out a noun. One version has Charles halting a banquet over a bracelet. Another has him halting a banquet over a brooch. Another has him halting a coronation banquet over an orb. Another has Kate, not Charles, halting the dinner. Another has Camilla trying to sit in a child's assigned chair. The structure never changes. Only the prop does. That is not journalism catching wind of a real event from multiple angles. That is a template, run through slightly different variables, optimized to catch anyone searching for royal drama that week. Once you notice the pattern, you start seeing it everywhere, not just in royal content, but across celebrity gossip, true crime, and history channels generally. The formula works because the emotional payoff feels real even when the underlying event is invented. And the fix for that isn't cynicism about every royal story. It's simply checking whether more than one independent named source is actually reporting the same specific claim. Which brings us back, gladly, to the bracelet itself. Because the true version of this story deserves a little more room, especially around what happened to the rest of Diana's actual jewelry after she died, since that context helps explain why people are primed to believe stories like the one we debunked today. When Diana died in 1997, her substantial personal jewelry collection, the pieces she genuinely owned rather than merely borrowed from the royal collection, passed to her 2 sons under the terms of her estate. Over the years since, William and Harry have each, at different points, given pieces from that inheritance to the women they married. The most famous example, by far, is the sapphire and diamond engagement ring Diana wore from 1981 onward, which William later gave to Catherine when he proposed in 2010, a ring now worn daily by the Princess of Wales and instantly recognizable around the world. Harry, similarly, incorporated diamonds that had belonged to his mother into the engagement ring he designed for Meghan in 2017. Both women have, at various points, also worn other pieces with a direct line back to Diana's personal collection, sometimes lent between them, sometimes gifted outright. This matters because it draws a clear, bright line between two categories of jewelry that outside observers, and frankly a lot of casual royal content, tend to blur together constantly. On one side, you have Diana's true personal property, which went to her sons, and from them to their wives. A lineage that is well documented, emotionally significant, and something the family has actually spoken about publicly. William in particular having described how meaningful it was to give Catherine his mother's ring. On the other side, you have the vast, much older institutional collection, tiaras and bracelets and necklaces that belong to the crown in practice, that get worn by whichever senior royal woman needs them for a given occasion, and that Diana, like every Princess of Wales and Queen before her, wore during her tenure without ever actually owning. The Cartier ruby bracelet belongs entirely to that second category. Confusing the two categories is exactly how you end up with headlines implying some kind of stolen inheritance, when the reality is a piece of state jewelry simply returning, as it always does, to whoever now holds the role it was made for. There's one more thread worth pulling before we close, and it's the question of why any of this is worth 4,500 words of narration in the first place, when the honest answer to the headline that started us here is simply, that didn't happen. The reason is that the true version is a better story. A fabricated scandal gives you 30 seconds of manufactured outrage and then evaporates, forgotten by the following week, replaced by the next invented crisis with a different noun swapped in. The real history of this bracelet gives you something that actually holds up under scrutiny, a genuine, almost century-long thread connecting 5 women, a war, a coronation nobody wanted, a young princess thrown into the deep end on the far side of the world, a death that stopped the planet for a week, and a slow, careful, quietly remarkable second act for a woman who spent 30 years being told she would never truly belong in that family at all. Camilla wearing that bracelet is not a scandal. It is, if anything, a strange kind of continuity, proof that the institution keeps moving forward, generation after generation, long after any individual person's story, tragic or triumphant, has run its course. So the next time a headline promises you that a king stormed out of a state dinner over a piece of jewelry, it's worth pausing for just a moment before you believe it. Not because royal families are incapable of real drama. History is full of genuine royal scandals that absolutely did happen and were extensively documented, but because the loudest, most emotionally engineered claims are so often the ones built entirely out of nothing at all. The real story was sitting there the whole time in auction records and newspaper archives from 1983, in the careful, patient tracking of jewelry historians who have spent years matching old photographs to new ones, one bracelet, one brooch, one tiara at a time. It just required someone to actually look. And that, in the end, is really the only lesson worth taking away from any of this. Royal jewelry stories are irresistible precisely because the objects themselves are real, tangible, photographed, dated, and traceable across generations in a way that most celebrity gossip never is. You can actually verify a bracelet. You can find the 1983 photograph from Tasmania. You can find the auction and estate records. You can find the jewelry historians who have spent entire careers doing nothing but matching stones to settings across 100 years of family portraits. That verifiability is exactly what makes it so disappointing when a fake scandal gets bolted onto a true object, because the true object never needed the fake drama to be interesting in the first place. A century-old bracelet that traveled from a shy young duchess to a grieving queen mother to a frightened princess on the far side of the world to a woman who spent 30 years as the most unpopular figure in the entire family was already a remarkable story before anyone ever invented a fictional banquet to go with it. Sometimes the truth really is enough.